Tonight, we begin with an intercepted communication that Western intelligence agencies had long anticipated, Kremlin insiders had desperately feared, and Ukrainian military planners had spent months orchestrating with surgical precision. A communication that unfolded not over days of careful deliberation, but in a single panicked phone call in the early hours of the morning. A phone call that revealed catastrophic failures at the highest levels of Russian military command. A phone call that exposed the true state of Russia's war machine in ways Moscow can no longer hide. A phone call that forced Sergei Shoigu, the man once considered untouchable in Putin's inner circle, to deliver news that no Russian leader ever wants to hear. What Ukraine did today crossed a threshold that Russian military doctrine had deemed impossible to breach. And when that threshold was crossed, the response from the Kremlin was not the confident dismissal we have come to expect. They responded with confusion, with blame, and with the kind of internal finger-pointing that reveals a system beginning to fracture under pressure. For weeks now, there had been intelligence chatter, not from official Ukrainian government sources, not from NATO press briefings, just chatter, that Kyiv was preparing something unprecedented against Russia's military backbone. Ukraine has been aggressive in their deep strike operations, yes, but they have been methodical in their aggression. Their targeting has followed a certain logic, a pattern, almost a strategic doctrine that Western analysts have come to recognize and predict. Oil refineries, ammunition depots, air defense installations, command posts, targets that degrade Russian capability without triggering the kind of response that could fundamentally change the nature of the conflict. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow this week was that the pattern suddenly and completely changed. Intelligence analysts who monitor Ukrainian military preparations know the indicators. The sudden repositioning of long-range strike assets to forward staging areas. The unusual concentration of special operations forces near specific infiltration corridors. The encrypted communications between Ukrainian general staff and frontline commanders that increased exponentially. The complete operational silence from units that had been actively engaged just days before. All of that went quiet. And whenever Ukraine goes operationally quiet on that scale, it means something massive is about to unfold. The silence lasted 72 hours. Then came the strikes. And then came the phone call that is now being analyzed in every intelligence agency across the Western world. Early this morning, signals intelligence units operating in coordination with allied agencies detected what they described as an emergency encrypted communication between the Russian Security Council and the Kremlin, including authentication protocols that had not been activated since the earliest and most chaotic days of the 2022 invasion. These are the kinds of emergency channels that senior Russian officials only use when they are signaling something catastrophic, a complete failure of military operations that cannot be concealed, a strategic setback so severe it threatens the entire war effort, or a situation so dire that only Putin himself can authorize the response. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three simultaneously. But what they did know was that something fundamental had gone wrong for Russia. And when things go fundamentally wrong for Russia's military leadership, the entire world needs to pay attention. The response from Russian military channels tonight was not the coordinated propaganda we typically see after Ukrainian successes. It was not routine denial and deflection. It was not carefully crafted messaging designed to minimize the damage. It was chaos. Source after source, military blogger after military blogger, described Russia's reaction as confused about how Ukraine had achieved such comprehensive targeting, alarmed at the scale of destruction across multiple strategic facilities, and perhaps most significantly, completely unprepared with any explanation for how their supposedly impenetrable defenses had failed so catastrophically. But chaos only conceals the truth temporarily. Tonight, the truth is emerging. And it is devastating for the Kremlin. Here's what we know. Within a 24-hour period, Ukrainian forces conducted what military analysts are calling the most These weren't symbolic strikes designed for propaganda value. These were precision attacks on the nervous system of Russia's war machine, the facilities that manufacture, store, coordinate, and deploy the weapons Russia depends upon to continue this conflict. Tonight, multiple intelligence sources confirmed that Ukraine launched a coordinated multi-vector operation targeting Russian military-industrial infrastructure, including a weapons manufacturing complex that had recently been expanded for what analysts believe was a major production increase ordered personally by Putin. Ukraine struck before that production could begin. They hit the primary assembly facility where Russia manufactures precision-guided munitions. They hit the logistics hub that distributes ammunition to forces across the entire front line. They hit the command coordination center that synchronizes Russian operations across multiple sectors. They hit the fuel storage depot that supplies the aviation units conducting glide bomb attacks against Ukrainian cities. They hit the maintenance facility that keeps Russia's remaining aircraft operational. In other words, Ukraine targeted the circulatory system of Russia's military, the production that creates the weapons, the logistics that move the weapons, the coordination that directs the weapons, the fuel that powers the weapons. This is what made Shoigu's emergency call to Putin so significant. This wasn't a tactical setback. This wasn't a localized failure. This was a strategic catastrophe that strikes at Russia's ability to sustain the war itself. And Shoigu, once the most powerful defense official in Russia, now relegated to the Security Council after a string of failures, had to be the one to deliver that news. Understanding the magnitude of what had happened, the Kremlin did what it always does when facing disaster. They looked for someone to blame, and tonight, that blame is falling on everyone except the person who actually bears responsibility, Vladimir Putin himself. And here's where the story becomes even more revealing about the true state of Russian power. Intelligence analysts now believe that Ukraine's operation was designed not just to destroy military infrastructure, but to expose the dysfunction at the heart of Putin's command structure. Ukraine wanted to see how Russia would respond to simultaneous strikes across multiple critical facilities, whether Russian air defenses could protect assets that had been declared impenetrable, whether Russian command structures could coordinate an effective response under pressure, whether Russian leadership would accept responsibility or descend into blame and recrimination. And the results exceeded Ukrainian expectations on every measure. Russian air defenses failed comprehensively across every targeted facility. Russian command structures showed no evidence of coordinated response for hours after the strikes began. And Russian leadership immediately began pointing fingers at each other rather than addressing the crisis. Defense officials speaking with Western media under condition of anonymity described the operation as systemic stress testing, deliberately designed to reveal weaknesses that Russia has been hiding from its own population. Ukraine proved today that they understand Russian dysfunction as well as Russian military positions. This was Ukraine demonstrating that they can attack Russia's military across every domain simultaneously. And comprehensive warfare is something Russia has been completely unable to counter since this conflict began. For every defensive measure they have implemented, for every resource they have allocated, Ukraine has found ways to penetrate, disrupt, and destroy. Today was the clearest demonstration yet that Ukraine is fighting a smarter war than Russia. Remember, Russia thought their military-industrial complex was beyond Ukrainian reach. They thought their air defenses would protect critical infrastructure. They thought their command structures would respond effectively to any attack. They thought their intelligence services would detect major operations before they could be launched. But tonight, the exact opposite of every one of those assumptions proved true. Ukrainian strikes penetrated defenses that were supposed to be impenetrable. Russian responses were slow, uncoordinated, and ineffective. Russian intelligence provided no warning of an operation that had been planned for months. And Russia's military-industrial capacity, the foundation of their ability to continue this war, has suffered damage that will take months or years to repair. For the first time since the invasion began, serious analysts are questioning whether Russia can sustain current operational tempo. And that question is more dangerous to Putin than any battlefield defeat. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous for Putin personally is that this catastrophe came at a time when he is already facing extraordinary pressure from multiple directions within his own system. Military hardliners want accountability for the failures that allowed these strikes to succeed. Industrial leaders want explanations for why facilities they were promised would be protected have been destroyed. Regional governors want resources to address the damage in their territories. Intelligence officials want someone to blame for the complete failure to detect the operation. And Shoigu once Putin's closest ally in the military sphere, is now fighting for his own political survival. Putin is balancing these demands while facing a Ukrainian military that has just demonstrated it can strike anywhere in Russia at any time. And when leaders in that position face pressure from all directions, they often make desperate decisions. Decisions that can escalate conflicts in unpredictable ways. Decisions that can fracture internal alliances beyond repair. Tonight, Putin is making those calculations. And no one, not his advisors, not Western intelligence, not even Putin himself, knows exactly where those calculations will lead. The Kremlin's official statement, now circulating through Russian state media with obvious reluctance, was designed to minimize the damage while buying time for a coordinated response. But minimization has its limits. Officials said plainly that terrorist attacks had targeted civilian infrastructure, language carefully chosen to avoid acknowledging the military nature of the targets. That is propaganda language for, we cannot admit what was actually destroyed. You don't usually see that kind of obvious deflection from Moscow unless the truth is too damaging to acknowledge. And tonight, the truth is extremely damaging. Russia's military-industrial capacity has suffered a blow that cannot be hidden from the officers who depend on that production. The soldiers who need those weapons will soon notice they are not arriving. The commanders who need those systems will soon realize they are not available. And when that realization spreads, no amount of propaganda will contain the consequences. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people and the world in a confident and purposeful statement tonight. He said, "We told Russia that nothing they have is beyond our reach. Tonight, we proved it." He said, "Every factory that produces weapons to kill our people is a legitimate target. Every depot, every command center, every facility that sustains their war of aggression." And he said, Shoigu can call Putin as many times as he wants. It will not change what is coming. It will not protect what we decide to destroy. And it will not save them from the consequences of what they have done. These are not rhetorical flourishes for domestic morale. These are statements from a commander-in-chief who has just authorized the most comprehensive strike operation of the war. Zelensky knows that Russia will attempt retaliation. He knows that the coming days will be dangerous. But he also knows that Ukraine has just demonstrated strategic capabilities that fundamentally change the equation of this conflict. Tonight, Ukraine is not just fighting. Ukraine is winning. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning for the Kremlin. Ukraine's operation was not isolated to a single target set. Along with the strikes on military-industrial infrastructure, Ukrainian forces also accelerated attacks on Russian logistics lines supporting frontline operations, creating immediate supply problems for units already stretched thin. Ukrainian intelligence services reportedly provided information that led to the neutralization of several Russian intelligence operatives attempting to gather targeting data on Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Ukrainian diplomatic channels intensified communications with Western partners about additional weapons systems that would expand Ukrainian strike capabilities even further. All of this happened within the same 72-hour operational window. When Ukraine coordinates actions across military, intelligence, and diplomatic domains simultaneously, it means strategic planning has reached an entirely new level of sophistication. It means Kyiv is operating with a long-term vision that extends far beyond individual battles. It means Russia is facing an adversary that is thinking several moves ahead. Western analysts are now considering several significant implications. One is that Ukraine will use this success to justify requests for additional long-range strike systems from Western partners, potentially including weapons that have so far been withheld. Another is that Ukraine will expand similar operations to target other pillars of Russian military capability, potentially including facilities even deeper inside Russian territory. A third possibility, the one generating the most concern in Moscow, is that Ukraine will continue systematic degradation of Russian military-industrial capacity until Russia can no longer produce enough weapons to sustain offensive operations. But today, Ukraine demonstrated something even more fundamental. They showed that Russian military infrastructure is not protected. They showed that Russian air defenses are not effective. They showed that Russian leadership is not competent. And they showed that Russian power is not what Moscow has claimed it to be. What we're watching now is a test of systemic resilience. Russia wants to demonstrate that it can absorb these strikes and continue operations without significant degradation. Ukraine wants to prove that systematic targeting of military infrastructure will eventually collapse Russia's ability to fight. Western nations want to see whether continued support for Ukraine is producing strategic results. And Putin wants to maintain the illusion of strength, while his actual strength erodes. Every day that passes without effective Russian response is a day that Ukraine's strategy is validated. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials across multiple Western agencies who are now monitoring Russian internal communications in real time. They say Russian military commanders are demanding explanations for defensive failures that no one in the chain of command wants to provide. They say Russian industrial managers are requesting emergency resources to repair damage that may be beyond immediate repair capability. And they say Putin's decision to publicly blame terrorism rather than acknowledge military failure is likely part of a strategy to buy time while the Kremlin figures out how to respond. But Ukraine is not giving Russia time. In fact, Ukraine is accelerating operations. Their strikes today, comprehensive, coordinated, and devastating, sent a message to Russia that there is no safe rear area. There is no protected infrastructure. There is no facility beyond Ukrainian reach. And it sent a message to the world that Ukraine is not simply surviving Russian aggression. Ukraine is systematically dismantling Russia's ability to sustain it. As the days go on, we expect more details to emerge about exactly which facilities were struck and what capabilities have been degraded. But what we already know is that Ukraine's operation was strategically transformative. It demonstrated reach that Russia believed Ukraine did not possess. It exposed vulnerabilities that Russia believed were protected. And it created political pressure within the Russian system that will be extremely difficult to resolve. What happens next will depend on how Putin chooses to respond. If they withdraw their remaining air assets from all contested sectors, Ukrainian ground forces immediately gain enormous tactical advantages. Ukraine, with Germany's help, has created a strategic situation with no good options for Russia. And that is exactly what winning looks like. And tonight, for the first time in many months of grinding conflict, Russian military leadership appears to be genuinely afraid of what they are facing. Moscow is quiet tonight, too quiet. And when the Kremlin is quiet after a significant battlefield humiliation, it means they are calculating. It means they are desperately searching for any effective response. It means they are being forced to confront the deeply uncomfortable possibility that they may have no good answers to this challenge. Because tonight, Russia learned something that fundamentally changes the trajectory of this conflict. German engineering is now deployed on the Ukrainian battlefield. Ukrainian defenders are now equipped with some of the most advanced defensive technology in the world. And Russian air superiority, the capability they believed would eventually decide this war in their favor, is now nothing more than a fading memory. This story is far from over. The technology competition between Russia and the Western alliance supporting Ukraine is accelerating and intensifying. The systems being deployed are becoming more advanced with each passing month. And the gap between Russian military capabilities and Western military capabilities is growing wider and more decisive every single day. But tonight, one thing is absolutely and undeniably clear. Germany finally stepped up in a decisive way. Ukraine delivered devastating results on the battlefield. And Russia is openly panicking. And we will be here, tracking every development, analyzing every Russian response, as this technological revolution continues to reshape the war. If he acknowledges the severity of the damage, he admits that his military leadership has failed. If he continues to minimize and deflect, he loses credibility with commanders who know the truth. If he escalates dramatically, he risks responses that Russia cannot afford. Every option before Putin is bad. And that is exactly what winning looks like for Ukraine. And tonight, for the first time in this entire conflict, Sergei Shoigu appears to be facing the consequences of his years of failure. The Kremlin is quiet about his future. Too quiet. And when the Kremlin is quiet about a senior official after a major disaster, it means calculations are being made. It means Putin is weighing loyalty against competence. It means careers that seem secure are suddenly on the edge. Because tonight, Russia learned something that changes everything. Ukrainian reach extends further than Moscow believed. Russian defenses are weaker than Moscow claimed, and Russian leadership is more fragile than Moscow admitted. This story is far from over. The fallout from today's strikes will reshape Russian military planning for months. The political consequences within Putin's inner circle are only beginning to unfold, and Ukraine's strategic campaign to degrade Russian military capability is accelerating. But tonight, one thing is absolutely clear. Ukraine struck Russia where it hurts most. Shoigu had to deliver the devastating news, and Putin is running out of options. And we will be here tracking every development, analyzing every response, as this extraordinary chapter of the war continues to unfold.